All right, sir. What are you doing here? This isn't your place.
I'm moving in. I showed you the lease already.
They're fake. He doesn't live here.
Yeah, we think so too.
You're coming with us.
Hold up, say that again. I'm your boss, dumbass.
Malcolm Rivers had spent 22 years earning every single thing he owned. The badge, the rank, the apartment on the fourth floor of Westbrook Apartments, whose deed sat in a manila folder on his kitchen counter with his name printed cleanly across the top. He had signed the papers 6 weeks ago, paid in full, and arranged the move for a Saturday morning in late spring, because after 2 decades of pressure and politics, and the particular exhaustion of navigating institutions that were never quite built for men who looked like him, a quiet Saturday felt like something he had earned too. He dressed the way anyone dresses when they are moving boxes and not trying to impress anyone. Dark jeans, gray t-shirt, clean sneakers. He pulled up to the building at 9:30 in the morning with a truck parked outside and a weekend ahead of him. The furniture company was coming in the afternoon. For now, it was just him and the boxes he preferred to carry himself, books, kitchen things, the personal items that felt wrong-handing to strangers. He took the first box through the lobby, rode the elevator to the fourth floor, and walked down the hallway toward apartment 4C. Then he went back for the second box. Then the third. On his fourth trip through the hallway, he noticed her. She was standing near the elevator with her arms folded across her chest, and the posture of someone who had spent a long time believing that the space around her was hers to manage. Her name was Deborah Lane. She had lived in apartment 4A for 12 years. She watched Rivers walk past her without saying anything, and he nodded politely and kept moving. On his fifth trip, she stepped forward. "Excuse me." Her voice had the particular sharpness of someone who treats confrontation as a right rather than a last resort. "What exactly are you doing?" Rivers looked at the box in his hands, then back at her with the patient expression of a man who has stood in this exact moment before. "I'm moving in," he said. Lane's eyes moved from him to the box to the apartment door he had been going in and out of all morning. "Moving in," she repeated, the words carrying a disbelief she wasn't attempting to hide. "Into this building." "Into apartment 4C, Rivers said. "I'm your new neighbor." She made a short sound, somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. "Someone like you cannot possibly be living here. I have been in this building for 12 years. I know every person who moves in and out, and I have not been told anything about a new tenant." "I'm not a tenant," Rivers said calmly. "I'm the owner. I purchased the apartment 6 weeks ago." Lane looked at him the way someone looks at a statement they have already decided is false. "I don't believe that. I don't know what you're actually doing here, but you look suspicious, and I'm calling the police." Rivers looked at her steadily. "Is it because I'm black?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said, "exactly because you're black. A black man like you doesn't belong here." Then she pulled out her phone and dialed while Rivers stood in the hallway of his own home, holding a box of his own belongings, listening to her describe him to a dispatcher. He set the box down against the wall, said nothing more to her, and went back to the elevator. He continued moving. He could hear her voice faintly from below as he carried boxes up, describing a suspicious black man in the building, her tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who believes they are performing a service. 8 minutes later, the elevator doors opened on the fourth floor, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. Officer Sean Whitaker came first. White, mid-40s, 15 years on the force, the kind of man who walks into situations with his conclusion already formed and looks for evidence to confirm it afterward. Officer Lucas Barrett followed behind him, younger, early 30s, 3 years in, moving with the careful deference of a man who had learned to follow his senior's lead before he'd learned to question it. Lane was waiting near the elevator and pointed immediately. "That's him." Whitaker walked toward Rivers with Barrett behind him. Rivers watched them come and set his box down, giving them his full attention. "What are you doing in this building?" Whitaker asked. His tone carrying the same energy Lane's had, guilt assumed, proof optional. "I'm moving into apartment 4C, Rivers said. "Is there a problem?" "We received a call about a suspicious individual. We need to verify that you actually live here." "That's fine," Rivers said. "Give me one moment." He went inside his apartment and returned 30 seconds later with a folder. He opened it and handed Whitaker the deed to apartment 4C. Registered in the name of Malcolm Rivers. Purchase completed 6 weeks prior. Every document official, legitimate, and thoroughly in order. Whitaker looked through the papers. Barrett looked over his shoulder. From down the hallway, Lane watched with her arms folded. When Whitaker didn't immediately move to arrest Rivers, Lane called out, "Those are probably fake. I've been here 12 years and nobody told me anything about a black man buying into this building. Those documents are not real." Something shifted in Whitaker's expression. Not doubt, recognition, the look of a man who has found the justification he was already looking for. He handed the documents back to Rivers. "She raises a fair point. These could be fraudulent." "They are not fraudulent," Rivers said, his voice still even. "Everything in that folder is legitimate and verifiable. If you have any doubt at all, call the number printed on the deed. The building management company is listed right there. One call and this is resolved in 30 seconds. Whitaker shook his head. "If the deed is fake, why would we call a number printed on it?" Rivers looked at him carefully. "So you're refusing to verify the documents by contacting the company that issued them?" "We need to verify everything at the station. You need to come with us." "I'm not going to any station," Rivers said clearly. "I have shown you my deed and my proof of ownership for this property. I have offered you a direct way to confirm everything. I know my rights, and I am standing in them right now." Barrett shifted his weight slightly. His eyes moved between Whitaker and Rivers, and something in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been unease, came and went without ever becoming words. "You need to calm down," Whitaker said, his voice dropping into the register officers use when they've decided the conversation is over. "We told you those documents could be fake. You're coming with us to the station so we can sort this out properly." "You want to arrest me," Rivers said, "even after I've shown you ownership documentation for this property?" Whitaker didn't answer. "Turn around slowly," he said, taking a step closer. Both officers were moving now, closing the space between themselves and Rivers with the body language of men who have already made a decision. Rivers had shown them his deed. He had shown them his proof of purchase. He had offered them a 30-second solution to every concern they claimed to have. They had dismissed all of it. He reached into his back pocket slowly, deliberately, making sure both officers could see every movement of his hands, and produced a leather badge wallet. He opened it and held it up. "Houston Police Department, Chief of Police, Malcolm Rivers." The hallway went completely silent. The color left Whitaker's face with the speed of a man watching his career end in real time. Barrett took a small, involuntary step backward without seeming to realize he had moved. Both of them knew that badge. They had been receiving internal department memos for 2 weeks about the new chief starting Monday. They had seen the name. They had seen the photograph. And they were standing in a hallway having just attempted to arrest him after he had shown them his deed and offered them a way to verify it, and they had chosen a neighbor's word over his documentation. From down the hallway, Lane's voice came one final time. "That badge is probably fake too." "Ma'am." Whitaker's voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting her off, his eyes never leaving the badge in Rivers's hand. Rivers closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. He looked at both officers with an expression that was completely composed and absolutely final. "I will see both of you in my office Monday morning," he said quietly. 8 a.m. Neither officer spoke. Rivers turned to Lane, who was standing down the hallway looking, for the first time, like a woman who understood the weight of what she had set in motion. "You will be hearing from my attorney," he said simply. Then he looked back at the officers. "Before either of you leaves this building, I need 3 things. The CCTV footage from this hallway covering today, the recording of the 911 call that brought you here, an official written documentation of this incident, your badge numbers, the call log, and everything said and done in this hallway today." Whitaker nodded once, the nod of a man who already knows he is standing in the wreckage of something he cannot repair. Rivers picked up his box from the hallway floor, carried it into apartment 4C, and closed the door behind him. He had a move to finish. He spent the rest of Saturday doing exactly that. The furniture arrived in the afternoon. By evening, he was sitting in his new apartment surrounded by unpacked boxes, eating dinner he had made himself, with 3 items on his phone: the CCTV footage, the 911 recording, and the incident documentation Whitaker had provided before leaving the building. He listened to the call once. He watched the footage once. Then he put his phone down and went to bed. Monday morning, he arrived at Houston Police Department headquarters at 7:45 in full chief's uniform. He greeted the desk officers, shook hands with the administrative staff who had been expecting him, and walked into his office for the first time. He sat behind the desk, opened the folder, and reviewed everything one final time with the quiet, methodical attention of a man who had spent 22 years building cases. At 8:00 a.m. exactly, Whitaker and Barrett came through the door. They sat down looking the way people look when they already know what the conversation is about, but are hoping the reality will be softer than the version they've been rehearsing since Saturday. Rivers said nothing immediately. He reached forward and pressed play on his laptop without introduction or explanation. Deborah Lane's voice filled the office, the dispatcher asking if the man had done anything threatening. Lane's voice answering that no, he hadn't done anything. She just didn't think a black man should be living in the building. 3 minutes and 14 seconds start to finish. When it ended, Rivers pressed stop. "That is the call you responded to," he said. "A woman called 911 because a black man was carrying boxes. The dispatcher confirmed no crime had occurred. You arrived, dismissed valid ownership documentation, refused a direct verification method I offered you, and attempted to arrest me." He played 30 seconds of the hallway footage. The moment he held up his deed and Whitaker dismissed it. The moment he offered the phone number and Whitaker refused it. The moment both officers stepped toward him to make the arrest. He closed the laptop. "I'm suspending both of you effective immediately pending a full internal affairs investigation. You will surrender your badges and service weapons to the duty officer before you leave this building today. You will not discuss this matter with any colleagues or any media. Internal affairs will give you both the opportunity to explain yourselves. That is their job. My job right now is to make sure this is handled properly and completely." Whitaker opened his mouth. Rivers raised one hand, and Whitaker closed it again. Both officers surrendered their badges and weapons that morning and left the building in plain clothes. Word moved through the department the way it always does when something significant happens, and by mid-morning every officer in the building knew that the new chief had arrived on his first day to find 2 colleagues suspended for trying to arrest him while he was moving into his own home on Saturday. Internal Affairs opened the investigation the same day and pulled the personnel files. What they found transformed a story about one Saturday morning into something much larger. Whitaker had been on the force for 15 years and had accumulated 11 racial profiling complaints during that time. 9 came from black residents who described being stopped, questioned, or detained without cause in situations where their documentation was dismissed in favor of a white person's unverified account. All 11 had been investigated internally and closed without meaningful discipline. 3 of them carried notes from reviewing supervisors describing Whitaker as a thorough and dedicated officer whose instincts had served the department well. Barrett had been on the force for 3 years and already had 7 complaints in his file. 6 came from minorities. 3 described situations remarkably similar to what had happened in the Westbrook hallway. Barrett following a senior officer's lead in dismissing valid documentation from a black resident while accepting a white person's contradicting account without question. His complaints had been closed with even less scrutiny than Whitaker's, largely because his bias was being attributed to inexperience rather than pattern. But the investigation didn't stop with the officers. Rivers had instructed internal affairs to pull everything connected to the Saturday incident, including the building's complete security history. And when investigators reviewed 2 years of Westbrook Apartments footage, they found something that made the investigation significantly larger. Deborah Lane appeared in the footage 114 times over 2 years. 41 of those appearances showed her in hallways or near the elevator with no obvious reason connected to her own movements through the building. She was watching people. Specifically, she was watching black residents, following their movements, positioning herself near the entrance when she saw them arrive. In 12 documented instances, she was shown reaching for her phone immediately after a black resident passed her in the hallway. Building management pulled their complaint records at investigators' request. Lane had filed 23 formal complaints over 12 years. 19 of them were against black residents. The complaints ranged from noise violations to suspicious behavior to property damage, none of which had ever been substantiated on investigation. 3 black tenants had moved out of Westbrook within 6 months of sustained complaint campaigns by Lane. 2 of them had left reviews on apartment listing websites mentioning a hostile neighbor who made them feel unwelcome and unsafe in their own home. Internal Affairs contacted all 3 former tenants. 2 agreed to speak. The first was a black woman who had lived in apartment 4B, directly next door to Lane, for 8 months before leaving. She described Lane knocking on her door to complain about noise while she was watching television at normal volume, calling building management repeatedly, and standing in the hallway staring at her door on multiple occasions. She had filed 2 complaints with management. Both were resolved with nothing more than a letter to Lane. She had left because staying had become too hostile to be worth it. The second was a black man who had lived in apartment 4D for 4 months before Lane's campaign made his daily life in the building so uncomfortable that leaving felt easier than fighting. He had not filed complaints because he didn't believe anything would change. Both of them, upon hearing what Lane had done to Rivers on Saturday, said the same thing in different words. They were not surprised. Rivers filed the civil lawsuit against Lane through his attorney on Wednesday, 4 days after moving day. Racial discrimination, harassment, filing a false police report motivated by racial bias, $200,000 in damages. Lane was served the papers at apartment 4A on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, someone had leaked the 911 recording to a local news station. By Thursday evening, it was national news. By Friday morning, 40 million people had heard Deborah Lane's voice telling a 911 dispatcher that she was calling because a black man didn't belong in her building, and learned that the black man was the city's new police chief. The recording did what recordings of explicit racism always do when they reach the public at that scale. It removed every possible defense before the legal case had even properly begun. There was no footage interpretation required, no competing accounts to weigh, no ambiguity about intent. Lane's voice said exactly what she meant, in plain language, to a government dispatcher on a recorded line. 40 million people heard it within 48 hours of it leaking, and by the time Lane's attorney released a statement claiming she had acted out of genuine concern for building safety and that her words had been taken out of context, those 40 million people had already heard the words themselves. The statement lasted approximately 6 hours before becoming completely unusable. There is no context in which telling a 911 dispatcher that you are calling because a black man doesn't belong in your building means something other than exactly what it sounds like. The attorney quietly stopped issuing statements after that. Rivers's attorney, meanwhile, was building a case that didn't need the recording to win, but was immeasurably stronger because of it. The CCTV footage was submitted as evidence. 114 hallway appearances, 41 instances of surveillance of black residents, 12 instances of Lane reaching for her phone immediately after a black person walked past her. The footage was edited into a clear chronological sequence. When Rivers's attorney showed it to opposing counsel in a pre-trial meeting, Lane's attorney asked for a 10-minute break and came back recommending his client consider settlement. Lane refused. She maintained that her actions were justified and the footage was being misrepresented. That decision brought the case to trial and put everything in front of a judge and jury. 2 years of documented surveillance. A recorded 911 call admitting racial motivation in Lane's own voice. 3 former tenant testimonies describing harassment campaigns that drove them from their homes. And 12 years of building management records showing 19 complaints filed against black residents with 0 substantiated findings. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found in Rivers's favor on every count, $200,000. The internal affairs investigation into Whitaker and Barrett concluded in 14 days. Both officers were fired. Whitaker's termination letter cited 11 racial profiling complaints, a consistent pattern of dismissing documentation from black residents in favor of unverified white accounts, and conduct on Saturday that the investigation concluded was not an isolated incident, but a direct continuation of a pattern the department had failed to address for 15 years. Barrett's termination letter cited 7 complaints in 3 years and a demonstrated willingness to follow a senior officer's racial profiling without exercising independent judgment or raising any of the professional concerns that the situation clearly warranted. Both appealed through the police union. The union reviewed the hallway footage, read the combined 18 complaints, and listened to the 911 recording. They declined to pursue the appeals further. Even the union could not construct a defense against footage showing 2 officers attempting to arrest their own chief after he had produced a legal deed, and offered a direct verification method, and they had dismissed both. The 3 former black tenants who had been driven from the building filed their own civil claims against Lane and the building management company. The management company, facing documented evidence that Lane's complaint campaigns had been inadequately handled for 12 years, settled both claims quickly, replaced the building manager who had overseen the inadequate responses, and issued a formal apology to all affected former residents. Rivers held a press conference 10 days after moving day. He stood at the podium in his chief's uniform and spoke for 4 minutes without notes. He described Saturday morning. He described the boxes. He described Lane telling him he didn't belong. He described showing 2 officers his deed and watching them choose her word over his documentation. And then he said the line that appeared in every headline the following morning. "I had a badge," he said, his voice quiet and completely steady. "Most people don't, and I need this city to understand that what happened to me on Saturday has been happening to people without badges in this building for 12 years, and in buildings like this one across this city for much longer than that. My badge got me out of that hallway. It shouldn't have been necessary. The deed should have been enough. Being a human being carrying boxes into your own home should have been enough." He paused for 3 seconds and looked directly at the cameras. "It wasn't, and that is what we are going to fix." The room was silent after he finished. No questions felt adequate to ask immediately after those words. Reporters who had covered Houston for years wrote afterward that they could not remember a press conference where the silence after a statement landed harder than the statement itself. Lane watched the press conference from apartment 4A knowing her trial was 3 weeks away, knowing the footage existed, knowing the recording existed, knowing that 3 people who had left the building because of her were going to sit in a courtroom and describe in detail what she had done to them. She had spent 12 years believing the building's whiteness was something she was maintaining. She had spent 12 years filing complaints, watching black residents leave, and feeling satisfied about it. And she had spent one Saturday morning telling a police chief he didn't belong somewhere he owned, and the entire structure of what she thought she was protecting had collapsed into a lawsuit, a national news story, and a courtroom date she could not avoid. After the verdict, the consequences arrived from multiple directions at once. Lane's employer, a mid-sized Houston real estate company, had been watching the story develop for 3 weeks before the verdict. They terminated her employment 2 days after the jury's decision, citing conduct incompatible with the company's stated values, effective immediately. No severance. 9 years of employment gone in a letter. The building management company, facing public scrutiny over 12 years of inadequate complaint handling, reviewed Lane's lease and found that her sustained campaign of harassment constituted a violation of the building's conduct policy. They issued a lease termination notice 4 weeks after the trial, 90 days to vacate. She moved out on a Tuesday morning with no one watching except the building security camera, which recorded her carrying boxes to a moving truck, through the same hallway, the same elevator, the same entrance where she had told Malcolm Rivers he didn't belong. She was gone before noon. Whitaker spent 4 months attempting to find law enforcement work in neighboring counties before accepting that his termination record and the public nature of his conduct had made him unemployable in the field. He took a job in private security at significantly reduced pay. His pension was under review pending a separate civil claim filed against him personally by a black resident he had wrongfully detained in 2019, someone who had refiled their previously dismissed complaint after the Westbrook incident made the pattern impossible to ignore. Barrett left law enforcement entirely, moved out of Houston within 2 months of being fired, and gave no interviews and made no public statements. His personnel file, now part of the public record, showed 7 complaints in 3 years that should have triggered intervention long before a hallway in Westbrook Apartments ended a career that had barely begun. Rivers used his position as chief to push through 3 specific reforms in his first year, each of which he described publicly as a direct response to what had happened on Saturday morning. The first required all officers to document their specific reason for doubting any identification or ownership documentation, rather than simply stating it might be fraudulent before dismissing it, a direct response to Whitaker's refusal to call the number on the deed. The second created an independent civilian review panel for all racial profiling complaints, removing the internal review process that had allowed Whitaker's 11 complaints and Barrett's 7 to be dismissed for years without consequence. The third established a community liaison program, placing officers in regular direct contact with the neighborhoods they patrolled, with accountability measures tied to community feedback rather than arrest numbers alone. Racial profiling complaints in the Houston Police Department dropped 47% in Rivers' first 2 years as chief. Use of force complaints dropped 31%. The department's relationship with black communities, damaged by years of exactly the behavior that Whitaker and Barrett's personnel files documented, began the slow and difficult work of rebuilding on actual accountability rather than the appearance of it. 5 years after moving day, Malcolm Rivers was still Houston's police chief. The reforms he had implemented had become models referenced by police departments in 4 other major cities. Deborah Lane was living in a different part of Houston, employed in a different industry, and permanently attached to a 911 recording that had been heard by tens of millions of people, and was still being used in fair housing training programs and civil rights seminars as one of the clearest recorded examples of someone stating their racial motivation without ambiguity in their own voice on a government line. The recording never stopped circulating. It never would. The $200,000 judgment sat on her financial record as the permanent consequence of one Saturday morning when she decided to tell a man he didn't belong somewhere he owned. The moving boxes had long been unpacked. The chief was in his office, and the hallway where she had made her stand was just a hallway now, with nothing in it except the building cameras that had recorded everything, and the knowledge that the woman who had spent 12 years deciding who belonged there had been the one asked to leave.